Welcome to Coffee Chat with me, your host, Linda. Uh, this is sponsored by Past Presence and the BC Genealogical Society. I thought for today's Coffee Chat, I would reflect back to you some of the lessons that I gleaned from Walter's Genealogy is on Tour hashtag. It felt like that. It wasn't meant to be like that, but it ended up being exactly that. And so this is stories, records, and what they can teach us. Lessons from Chinese Canadian genealogy. This photo, for example, is from Harling Point, which is the Chinese cemetery at Victoria. February 25th through March 4th, I gave 4 talks in 1 week. And so this is the most ambitious I have ever been in terms of presenting. There were 2 sessions at the Victoria Chinatown Museum, invited by the program coordinator, Charlene Thornton-Joe, and welcomed by the board of the Victoria Chinatown Museum. Secondly, there was Finding the Records for Impossible Genealogy for the Surrey Libraries, Cloverdale. That was, so the first 2 were the Tuesday. The third one was the Thursday, and the following one, Reconstructing Invisible Lives, was the following Monday. And so I wasn't even sure that I was going to be able to successfully present 3 different themes in a week, but it was a great exercise. I was up to the challenge, and this is what I learned. It doesn't really matter actually what the topic is about. There are certain themes that are showing themselves in all of my talks, and that is when I focus on Chinese Canadian genealogy. Uh, it is personal, and that probably gives it its resonance because it's personal for me. It's historical, obviously. It's structural. We really do study structure in uncovering Chinese Canadian genealogy, and it's contextual. We cannot understand genealogy without context. Another theme that keeps showing up is so many lost stories. And in doing this work, it's like story recovery. Like we make the invisible people visible again. And I really saw that in this week's worth of talks. Often in Chinese Canadian genealogy, we have only names and dates, but we can actually use that. We can start there and we can use that as a basis to build evidence-based genealogy. I think quite a few people think, I've only got this one record, or I've only got these tiny few details, and so it's impossible to start there. But no, we have enough method now developed that we can at least give a few clues to help build that foundation. Another thing that keeps coming through is the availability of records, where our group is working on, uncovering records, finding where the records are kept, how they were created. And that's what we're understanding is that missing records have in the past made people think that their stories are impossible or just can't be found, which conceals, right, the story. But actually it's, the stories are still there. They might be found in different places than you would expect. And then finally, this Chinese Canadian genealogy is about method. It's about difficult genealogy or different genealogy, and making the method, creating the methodology is what's really coming through for me. The successful way through is through method, and so method matters. Okay, so in my first talk, getting started in Chinese Canadian genealogy, the goal was to bring visitors to the museum and to make the work, the exhibits, like inviting, and to make them, I mean, more, like they are inviting, but to help uncover some of the stories behind them. And then this long running theme, right, of silence in our community where we don't have the stories, to give some reasons for that silence, to provide to the audience some reasons why they might not have heard these stories. It was pretty funny actually, because in the audience I expanded on that theme where you might have heard a story which is great, or you might have heard a story that doesn't make any sense, which is a little confusing, or you might have heard a fairy tale, something completely made up, what we in the business call a lie, and you might not have heard anything at all, or any combination thereof. And so that was a theme that resonated with the audiences in Victoria, and I could see people nodding along to the outright lie part or things that were really confusing. And then to give reasons, I provided structured reasons as to why there might be a silence. I did this through personal examples of stories behind the records. The photo shows me with my dad's CI-45. And then because it's Victoria, I actually have family in Victoria. So I used images from my own collection to make it really sing, to make it relevant to the audience. And what it taught me is these two talks live. What I really wanted to do was connect with the audience. And so I added a couple of elements, such as asking first, tell me about you. I asked a number of questions. Has anyone done their genealogy before, for example? And that's when I realized that I would really have to change the arc of the talk in like on the fly, because maybe not even 10% of the audience maybe had tried their genealogy already. And so they weren't ready to learn about genealogy. As we know, it's difficult. You need a lot of contextual information. And so in that moment, I knew that I was going to change from teaching about genealogy to telling stories about genealogy to give like contextual information. In the afternoon, there were two sessions, 2 and 7. In the afternoon, we had a very different audience, a very different vibe from the evening, and both were great. In the afternoon, we had, for example, board members of the Victoria Chinatown Museum with, multiple degrees, and it's always interesting to me to be able to present in front of, such an august audience. Uh, for example, the head of the CCBA, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, I think, was there. The sponsors were there, board chair, board members, Dr. Khan was my introducer. And John Adams, the author of Chinatown, Victoria, was front row. So that was really interesting. And then in the afternoon, we had members of the public, including someone from Genealogy for Asian Canadians. Walter showed up and surprised me by coming over from Vancouver. So here he is on the right. And what was really funny about this talk is, as I said, I was personalizing it, right? I drew from local research. I walked the streets. I was looking for the address of my great granduncle's store, Wing Yik, and I took a picture of it and talked about that because the people in the audience are very connected to their Chinatown. And so speaking about the buildings and the history of the buildings that are there resonated with the people who were there. But what was funny, it was hysterical actually, was this lady here on the right, who after my talk said, "Oh, that slide that you have of Wing Yik using my own photos, right? This man, my cousin and his father, that's my gong gong." That's my gong gong. I actually had like a cousin I didn't know in the audience. And so that was fun. This is Dr. Grace Wong Snedden. She's chair of the VCM, presenting my gift, and it was really nice to meet Grace on this trip. What I really noticed in these two talks is beginners to genealogy really need almost permission to start before they know everything. Like they feel like they need to gather so much more before they get started. And actually, it's the opposite because help is available, right? So people really appreciate having people like us, right, to get into the subject, to highlight the next step forward. All right. The second talk was Finding the Records for Impossible Genealogy, Lessons from an Accredited Genealogist. And it was held at the Cloverdale Library, which, if you don't know, is one of the great genealogical libraries in the Lower Mainland. There were members there from the BC Genealogical Society, so a very learned group already. There were friends who came, personal friends who were in the audience. Uh, one of my friends drove up from Bellingham and then stuck himself in the back of the audience and only said hi at the end of it. This also was a sold out talk. It was my first sellout, and I was so thrilled to be able to speak to like such a learned audience. And so I'll take you through some highlights of that talk. Uh, the Cloverdale Library asked for an emphasis on archives. As an archive themselves, as a genealogical library, they wanted like how one uses archives to do genealogy. And so I, for example, gave this slide which is a map of all of the archives I have visited since 2018. And I won't go through them. I'm just saying this is, to be a genealogist in Canada, one needs to leave your office and go visit real life archives and learn to do research the archival way. Because those of you who have seen my talks before, you'll seen this before, but this breaks down information and genealogical information and how we use it, because as I think should be clear, no record that we use for genealogy was created for genealogy, like not the original primary sources. Secondary sources such as collected works, people's histories, genealogies, those are those used like primary sources, but the primary sources such as vital statistics records, letters, wills, those things, they're created for other purposes. And so this pyramid talks about the accessibility of records. At the bottom, it's all records ever created in the history of mankind. And at the top, records that we can actually find that are scanned online and searchable with a finding aid, which is kind of where we expect everything to be. And then all the things that are in between. So it was a structured talk about archives. And what I liked about this talk is that I got to use some recent research on Hudson's Bay Company records to bust this particular myth. There are no passenger manifests for the West Coast before 1905. But are there? And I won't give it away. But what I loved is I asked the audience if they thought that was true, and one man shook his head. And he later gave his own personal example. And I love when audience members offer that kind of idea of what they've been working on. And as I said, these are members of the BCGS. I think for me, a successful talk is when people, first of all, invite you back. And secondly, when people have questions. And in this case, as it was live, people lined up to ask me questions. And the first lady who I had seen in the second row, she said, she gave me just the greatest compliment and said, "You are a natural teacher. You break down concepts with such clarity. It is easy to follow your thought pattern." And then she offered a tip and said, "You also drop your emphasis on your last word in your sentence. And so watch that." And it's true, I do. And so thank you. Thank you for that. There were friends in the audience who came forward to say hello, to share their stories. And I've given this talk many times, but not this kind of talk. And I feel like I'm still evolving and developing the ideas behind it, which is not just, the idea that one needs to learn to polish up on our methods in visiting archives and understanding not everything has a finding aid, and sometimes you have to use an archivist, but also in terms of what is an archive, what is held in an archive, the problems that are facing archives. For example, this year, I believe it's Halton Peel recently had to deaccession their archive because funding, right? We rely on public funding, and with government cutbacks, all of that is in jeopardy. So this talk was was different, but very similar to getting started in Chinese genealogy, where that was about stories in Chinese genealogy, and this one was about where you find the records. My third one, presented on the 1st of March, was something I have never done before. It was a case study, and um, I don't know why I've never done a case study before, because honestly, it was so much fun. It was so much fun to reconstruct the steps by which I cracked the case. And this talk really was about method. It was about method and methodology and evidence. And it was also about stubbornness and, chasing a thing. The I had been to Kelowna in November 2025 and to give a talk. It was Commando Bay and the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. And it talked about Chinese Canadians in the Second World War, the first 13 who trained at Commando Bay on Okanagan Lake. But I was there for about 4 days, and one of those days I was invited by Claire Smith Burns, president of the Kelowna and District Genealogical Society, to spend a day in museums and archives and with the KDGS. So this is us. This is us at the archives where the archivist had pulled these specific Chinese Canadian records, which I had never seen because unfortunately the Kelowna Archives just has not created funding aids and are resource constrained, so funding aids are probably not going to be created. So if you want things from the archives, you have to contact the archivist. And so she showed me Chinese Canadian directories, for example, which are absolute gold in this kind of history. So here we have members of the KDGS, Claire Smith Burns in the Kelowna Library, a great collaborative effort where I mentioned the Cloverdale Library has this wonderful genealogical library in the lower mainland of BC. Claire and her team arranged a partnership with the Kelowna Library to site the genealogical library within the libraries, and so I got a tour, and it is fantastic. So Kelowna residents, you guys are super lucky. We also got a tour of the military museum, which, having just given a talk about Force 136 or Commando Bay, I was very interested in seeing. And so, yeah, that was Kelowna. Okay, the talk. Let's talk about the talk. I opened, remember, this was a case study, which is a reflection of, how you crack a case. And I thought I would share this one with you where, first of all, it was several years of research. It was a team. I was the initial researcher, but then later on it developed into a team. I have 494 notes on this family, 200 people in the tree. There were some constraints at the time. Newspapers.com, for example, did not have any Kamloops titles. Ancestry had no hints, and so it was a different methodology to solve this case. The challenges in this case were, for example, these things. Names, Chinese names, misinterpretation, misspellings, mistakes is what I call that slide of names. I gave examples from the case. Also, there was missing and contradictory evidence, which is so important to talk about as a genealogist because we often find contradictory evidence where two records or two analyses conflict. And if you can't resolve them, it's really important for you to show both things. That there's doubt. That is the mark of a good genealogist, that there is doubt in the conclusions that you're drawing. And so here's what, analysis A says, and here's what analysis B says. Thirdly, it was a great example of racialized record keeping where I'm chasing a Chinese woman. And it's not just Chinese Canadian and all of that, what that implies with racism and racialized records, but also a woman. It doesn't matter what kind of genealogy we're doing, tracing women is harder than men. And so both things. Legal and social barriers, and then, that makes women almost invisible. So I went into that. what I really loved about and what resonated with the audience were the breakdowns, the methods, what showed direct evidence, what showed indirect evidence, what showed negative evidence, and all the tools that I used in the study. And so I went through all of these 8 categories of the things that I used to crack the case, including the breakthrough piece, which you're going to have to come see that case study when I present it again. So 3 talks, 1 week, different themes, and these are the 3 things that this says to me. First of all, it really doesn't matter where I present, and I presented virtually across Canada and the United States. Our community, our Chinese hyphenated community in North America, Canada, and the US, we share similar experiences. We do. Uh, Often there is complete total silence. Our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors, they didn't talk about it, or if they did, it was only partial or it was sketchy. They had records that didn't make any sense, or they didn't keep any records, or they threw them out. That is common across all the audiences. Secondly, is that our community is so hungry for our stories. And so when you're doing this work, please write some stories, like put it together and make it make sense for other people. These are the stories that really matter. And especially when we are speaking into the gap of the silence and explaining it, uh, it's wide open. Also, this type of genealogy, Chinese Canadian genealogy, teaches us about gaps, about record gaps, not only the stories and the silences, but also the records that were not collected, or where Chinese were specifically and deliberately excluded from the records. Then it teaches us about historical systems. Oftentimes they are racialized systems. And then the missing records. So wrapping it up, my closing thoughts here. As late as 2013, Chinese Canadian genealogy was called impossible, but really it's not impossible, it's different. What was different about it is that there was a distinct lack of established method, which made all of the questions and the brick walls insurmountable. I'm often reminded of Brene Brown, who I think she set out to study pride, but she ended up becoming a researcher in shame. I set out to find method for Chinese Canadian genealogy, and I end up being a student of racism. It comes part and parcel with the territory. It unfortunately, like as a genealogist, you trace where the clues lead you. You might have an idea of where you think you want to go, but actually you have to follow where the clues lead. And when we are talking about Chinese Canadian genealogy and lessons for other types of racialized, underrepresented groups, minority groups, you follow the records that were created by the laws, court cases, criminal records, prison records, immigration records, mental hospitals, what was called mental hospitals or sanatoriums in the day. Sometimes those are the sources that we have to find and trace. And so we don't set out, right, to study racism and its effects and generational trauma, but we have to, because that's what created some of the richest records for our community. And so I want to leave you with this idea, which I've been formulating over the course of now 3 decades of working like this. This is really genealogical justice. That's my new term for it. We transform the records created for racist reasons into stories for our community. Okay, so I'm Linda Yip. This is my coffee chat for March 11th, 2026. I will stop recording and invite you to ask questions.